Night fell heavy over the vast Texas plains. Only dark clouds hid the moon, and wind hissed through tall grass. Beside the old barn, the first torch flared to life. 3 shadows moved silently, boots careful to avoid every patch of light. The sharp smell of coal oil spread, cutting through the dead-still air. Chickens fell silent in the coop. Not a single sound. Only breathing tight and a heart inside the chest of the woman behind the thin wooden door. She had already lost too much on this land. Her father, her husband. Now they wanted what was left by fire. The cabin door burst open with a crack that echoed across the yard. A towering figure stood on the porch, taller than the doorframe her father had built. Her hand gripped the old shotgun tight. Her eyes caught the torchlight like steel. The torch rose higher. Flame licked toward dry grass. She stepped forward. No hesitation. The wind came first. Always did. Hazel Thorne felt it before she saw it, that particular hush that fell over the Texas grass, right before the sky decided to lose its mind. She stood in the doorway of her cabin, one hand braced against the frame her father built. Her hand alone nearly spanned it because that was Hazel. Bigger than the doorway. Bigger than most everything. 7 feet if you round it up, and she rounded up. No sense pretending otherwise. The chickens knew the storm was coming before she did. They always did. Skittering under the porch, feathers puffed, clucking like old women at a funeral. Hazel watched them go. Watched the sky turn the color of a bruise. Watched the far tree line bend sideways like it wanted to run too. She didn't run. She never did. 3 years now. 3 years since Daniel died and left her this cabin, this land, and a silence so big it had its own weather. She went inside, latched the shutters. Because a storm like this didn't knock politely, it came in swinging, and a woman learned to swing back, or she learned to lose things. Hazel had already lost enough, the lamp guttered. She turned the wick down low, saving oil, saving everything, because that was what a widow did on land, people had whispered. Not anymore. Not after what happened to her father. 12 years now, since they'd buried him. She still counted it in her sleep, sometimes counted it the way some women counted rosary beads, a private arithmetic of grief that never quite balanced out no matter how many times she ran the numbers. Her father had come out from Georgia with nothing but a mule and a promise, and he died still believing the land was worth every callous it had cost him. Hazel wasn't sure some days if she believed the same thing, or if she just kept believing it because stopping felt like letting him down twice. A sound at the gate, not thunder. Different. Metal on metal, the latch, rattling. Hazel's hand found the shotgun leaned by the door before her mind caught up to her body. Old habit, older than fear. She looked out through the shutter slat. There he was, a man, alone. No horse, no wagon. Just a man walking straight into the storm like the storm owed him money. He stopped at her gate. Just stood there, hat in his hands, rain already soaking through his shirt, and looked up at her window like he knew she was watching, which she was. Ma'am, his voice barely carried over the wind. So, storm about to open up something fierce, wondering if I might trouble you for your porch. Hazel didn't answer right away because here was the thing nobody understood about being her size. Men either ran, turned pale, backed off like she was some circus attraction escaped from its cage, or they got that other look, the calculating one. The one that measured her like livestock, like a prize bull nobody could quite believe was real. She hated both looks equally. This man wasn't doing either. He was just standing there, soaked, waiting. Hat in his hands like he had all the manners his mother ever taught him and nowhere better to spend them. Lightning cracked white across the yard. For 1/2 of 1 second, she saw him clear dark hair plastered to his forehead, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same stone as her doorframe, and eyes that didn't flinch when they landed on her, didn't widen, didn't do the thing eyes usually did. Thunder rolled in right behind it, so close it rattled her teeth. Porch, she called out. That 2 syllables, that was all she gave him, not an invitation inside, not yet. Maybe not ever. But the porch had a roof, and even Hazel Thorne wasn't cruel enough to leave a man standing in that. He nodded once. Lifted the gate latch slow careful, like he didn't want to startle her, which was almost funny, because nothing about her startled easy anymore, and looped the rawhide tie back around the post behind him. Small thing. Shouldn't have mattered, it mattered, because most men who came through that gate left it swinging. Left it broken, actually, 3 years broken, same as everything else Daniel never got around to fixing before the fever took him. This man closed it without being asked. Hazel set the shotgun back against the wall. Didn't put it away. Just set it close enough to grab and far enough to pretend she wasn't thinking about it. She opened the door a crack. There's a chair, she said. Don't lock. Legs loose, yes ma'am. He climbed the steps. And here was the part that made her chest go tight. The part she wasn't ready, for he didn't look up at her like she expected. Didn't do the slow drag of the eyes, top to bottom, the measuring. He just crossed the port, set his hat on the rail, and sat. Didn't rock the chair. Didn't say another word. Just closed his eyes and breathed out. Long, slow, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying a long, long way. Hazel stood in her doorway another moment, watching him. Waiting for the look, the stare, the thing that always came. It didn't come, so she shut the door, latched it. Sat back down at her, mending needle trembling just slightly in a hand, strong enough to snap the needle in half if she wanted. She didn't want to. The storm hit full force 2 minutes later. Rain like gravel on the tin roof. Wind that found every gap in the wood and screamed through it. Hazel sewed by lamplight and told herself she wasn't listening for him. She was listening for him. Through the wall, through the wind, she caught it a low sound. Pain, maybe. Bitten back fast. Like a man who'd trained himself not to make noises, even when nobody official said he had to be quiet. She frowned at her mending. Set it down because that sound, that specific sound. She'd heard it before from her own father, the year he took a kick from a mule to the ribs and spent 2 weeks pretending he was fine. She should mind her business. She minded her business exactly 4 more minutes before she got up, grabbed the limp and opened the door. He was sitting exactly where she left him. Straighter now, though, tighter around the shoulders. Trying not to show it. You're hurt, she said. Not a question. I'm fine, ma'am. Don't lie to me on my own porch. His mouth did something close to a smile. Didn't quite finish the job. Wasn't planning to make a habit of it, lightning again. Closer this time. In the flash, she saw it, the dark stain spreading through the shoulder of his shirt, darker than rain had any right to make anything. That's blood, she said. Barbed wire. Fast. Too fast. Like he'd practiced saying it, Hazel had mended enough fence in her life to know exactly what barbed wire did to a shoulder. It tore. Long and ragged. Didn't punch a hole clean through fabric the way this had. She said nothing. Filed it away. Because a woman alone on land, people wanted to learn to file things away instead of asking about them out loud. Learned patience was its own kind of weapon. You got a name? She asked instead. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she almost regretted asking Jonah. He said finally, just Jonah, no last name offered, she noticed. Filed that away too, Hazel, she said back, because fair was fair. Hazel Thorne. Something crossed his face when she said Thorne. Quick, gone before she could name it. If she hadn't spent 3 years learning to read every flicker of expression on every face that came near her land, she'd have missed it entirely. She didn't. You know that name, she said. No, ma'am. Too smooth. Too fast again. 2 lies in 5 minutes. Hazel closed the door on that thought the same way she closed the cabin door firm. Final, latch tight. Storm will blow through by morning, she said. You can sleep there. Chair's not much, but it's dry. Obliged. She went back inside. Didn't sleep. Lay on her narrow bed, listening to the rain hammer, the roof and the wind try to peel it back. And somewhere under all that noise, the small creak of a man trying not to move too much in a chair with a bad shoulder and worse secrets. She thought about her father's shotgun, propped by the door. About the fact that she hadn't once, in the whole strange evening, felt truly afraid of the man on her porch, and about how much stranger that fact was than anything else that had happened since the gate latch rattled. By dawn, the storm had blown itself out somewhere east, leaving the yard soaked and steaming under a pale gray sky. Hazel woke to a sound that didn't belong. Metal. Striking. Metal. Rhythmic. Purposeful. She grabbed the shotgun before she grabbed her boots. Old habit again. The oldest one. She stepped onto the porch and found the chair empty. Found him instead at the gate, her broken gate. The one that had hung crooked and useless for 3 years, with his shirt off and his back to her, and that stopped her cold. Because his back told a story his mouth never would. Scars. Old ones, silvered with age. Crossing his shoulder blades in lines too straight, too deliberate to be accident. The kind of marks a man carried from something done to him on purpose. She'd seen scars like that once. On a man who used to work the cane spread before he disappeared one winter, and nobody asked too many questions about where. Jonah heard her boots on the steps and turned. Didn't flinch at being seen. Didn't reach for his shirt to cover up. Gate was hanging poor, he said. Like that explained the tools spread neat across her dirt. Her father's tools, the ones she hadn't touched in 3 years, because touching them meant admitting he was really gone. Figured to fix it. Didn't ask you to. No, ma'am. He tested a strip of rawhide between 2 hands, hands broader and cleaner than any drifter's had a right to be. But a body's got to pay for cornbread somehow. Hazel's jaw tightened, because she hadn't given him cornbread. Hadn't given him anything but a chair and a roof, and even that grudging. And that gate had been broken since the week they buried Daniel, and she'd walked past it every single morning telling herself she'd get to it eventually, knowing full well eventually wasn't coming. She lowered the shotgun. Not all the way. "Enough, you hungry?" she asked. "Could eat? Coffee's on the stove?" Except it wasn't. She hadn't lit it yet. She said it anyway, because saying it felt like the next right thing to say, and by the time she got inside, the stove was already warm. Kindling laid neat, water already hauled and waiting in the kettle. He'd done that too, before she was even awake. Her hands weren't quite steady when she measured the coffee grounds, because this wasn't a drifter. Drifters didn't rise before dawn to lay kindling unasked, or carry old scars like a man who'd survived something and decided never to speak of it. Something else then. Something she didn't have a name for yet. She carried 2 cups outside, found the gate swinging smooth and silent on hinges that hadn't moved right in 3 years. Jonah wiped his hands on a rag, took the cup she offered, and drank like a man who hadn't had anything warm in days. "Gate's done," he said, handing the cup back half full. "Storm's passed. I'll be moving on, I expect." Hazel looked at the gate, at the fire in her stove, at the water bucket filled that she hadn't touched since yesterday. He'd given her back something, small thing. But it landed heavy the strange, quiet gift of waking up to something fixed instead of broken. For the first time in 3 years of everything staying exactly, permanently broken. "Wait," she heard herself say. He stopped at the bottom step. And here was where she should have told the truth. Should have said the creek was low, the ford was clear, the road was fine for traveling. She lied instead. "Creek's up," she said. "Ford's washed out from the storm. You'd have to go 5 miles north to cross safe." They both knew the creek ran shallow that time of year, barely wet a boot. But he didn't call her on it, just stood there at the bottom of the steps, water dripping off his hat brim, waiting. "I've got fence needs mending," she added, voice steadier than she felt. "Back 40. Wind tore a stretch of it loose last night. I could pay you in meals, you're willing to work it." A long silence. Long enough that she started composing the words to take it back. "Fair trade," he said finally. "Where's this fence at?" Relief moved through her, quick and unwelcome. She didn't let it show. "I'll walk you out after breakfast." He nodded, picked his hat back up off the rail, set it on his head like a man settling in for a longer stay than either of them was willing to say out loud. They ate in near silence cornbread from the day before, eggs from her 3 scrawny chickens, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Jonah ate like a man who'd learned somewhere along the way not to waste a single bite, and Hazel found herself watching the way he handled the fork, the careful economy of his movements, and wondering, not for the first time that morning, exact what kind of life taught a man to move like that. She broke the silence first, surprising herself. "You gonna tell me your last name? Or am I meant to just keep calling you Jonah like you're a stray dog I took pity on?" A short laugh escaped him real, unguarded, the first she'd ever heard. "Fair point, ma'am. Figured a man ought to earn a last name before he goes handing it out. Earn it how? Suppose that depends on the man." He wiped his plate clean with the last corner of cornbread. "Some earn it with money. Some with a name their daddy left them. Others just earn it by sticking around long enough somebody trusts them with it." Hazel studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "That's supposed to mean you're planning on sticking around?" A ghost of that half smile again. "Said it was a way a man could earn it. Didn't say which way I was aiming for." She let that sit between them, unanswered. The way she let most things sit days turned for slow, examined from every angle before she decided whether it deserved a response. "My father used to say a man's word was the only currency worth trusting," she said finally. "Said paper money could burn, land could get stolen. But a man's word, if it was good, that was the one thing nobody could take from him." Sounds like a man worth listening to. He was. She stood, gathering the plates, kneading her hands busy. "Buried him 12 years back, and I still hear him some mornings, telling me the same 3 or 4 things he always told me: work hard. Don't owe nobody nothing you can't pay back fair. And never let a man's silence do the talking his mouth ought to be doing." Something flickered across Jonah's face at that quick, gone before she could name it, same as it had the first night she'd said her own name. But he didn't say anything more, just helped her clear the table, moving through her small kitchen like a man learning the shape of a life he hadn't quite decided yet, whether he wanted to stay inside of. 3 days in, Hazel had stopped pretending she wasn't watching for him each morning. He worked the back fence at first light, before the sun turned mean, wire and hammer slung across his good shoulder, moving along the line, testing tension the way a man tested, trust slow, careful, 1 strand at a time. She tended her garden in the growing heat. 3 scrawny chickens underfoot, pecking at everything except what she wanted them pecking at. Tomatoes fighting the dry ground. Beans climbing strings she'd tied herself. Because nobody else ever had, not since her father died, not since Daniel followed him 3 years later, like the land itself was cursed, to take the men and leave her standing. She caught herself, once, watching Jonah's shoulders work as he stretched wire taut. Caught herself and looked away fast, face hot, heart doing something stupid and unfamiliar. Stop that, she told herself. Just stop. Because men like that didn't stay. Men like that fixed a gate, mended a fence, ate their fill, and moved on toward whatever they were really running from. And a woman her size had learned that particular lesson early and learned it hard. There had been a man once, years before Daniel, who'd courted her for a whole spring season and then quietly stopped coming around once his friends started calling him names for it. She still remembered the exact shape of his absence, the way it had taught her more than any kind word ever could, except he hadn't looked at her the way men usually looked. Hadn't flinched, hadn't gawked, hadn't done the calculating thing with his eyes like she was some oddity to be priced and sold. He'd looked at her like she's just a woman. Standing in a garden, that was all, which scared her more than any storm. By midday, the heat pressed down like a hand on the chest, kind of Texas summer that made even the crickets go quiet for an hour or two out of sheer exhaustion. Joe worked through it anyway, sweat darkening his shirt, and Hazel carried water out to him without being asked, the way she'd started doing without quite noticing she'd started. You don't have to keep at it in this heat, she told him once, standing in the thin shade of a fence post. Neither do you, he said, nodding toward her garden, toward the sweat on her own brow. It's my land. Figured that's reason enough for me too. For the time being, sets it simple, no weight to it, and went back to the wire. She thought about that sentence longer than she meant to. On the morning of the fourth day, an errand couldn't wait any longer, flour running low, thread for mending, and a letter Hazel had been meaning to post for a month to her cousin in Waco. She hitched the mule and rode into the small crossroads settlement that passed for a town nearby, more habit than necessity keeping her from asking Jonah to come along. The general store smelled of coffee and leather and dust, same as always. Mrs. Pruitt behind the counter greeted her the way she always did, polite enough, but with that particular carefulness people used when they were talking to something they weren't quite sure how to categorize. Hazel, a nod. Nothing more, Ada. Hazel set her list on the counter. Flour, if you've got a full sack. Thread, dark brown. Two other women stood near the back of the store, examining bolts of calico, and Hazel caught the low murmur of their conversation before it cut off entirely that particular silence that fell. Whenever she walked into a room, the kind that told her exactly what had been said, a half-second before she'd arrived. She'd learned, over the years, not to let her face show what that silence cost her. Heard you've got a man staying out at your place, Mrs. Pruitt said, weighing the flour with more attention than the scale strictly required. Not quite a question. Fishing, the way small towns fished, with a hook baited in innocent curiosity. Hired hand, Hazel said. Flat? Fixing fence, that so? Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows did something complicated, awful particular kind of hired hand, from what Jed says. Says the man carries himself like quality folk. Jed says a lot of things. Hazel counted out coins for the flour, careful and precise. Most of them not his business to say. She left the store with her purchases and her dignity both intact, though it cost her something to walk out steady instead of stiff. The ride home gave her time to turn the exchange over in her mind, the way she turned over most things that slow, careful, looking for the part that could be set down and left behind instead of carried. Because that was the trouble with a small county. Everybody had an opinion about Hazel Thorne, and most of those opinions had been formed the day she turned 12 years old and kept growing past every other girl in her schoolhouse. Past most of the boys, too, until by 15 she'd stood a full head taller than her own father, and the whispering had started in earnest and never really stopped. She found Jonah at the fence when she returned, exactly where she'd left him, and something in his face, some quiet attentiveness, told her he'd noticed she'd come back quieter than she'd left. Town talk? He asked. Not quite a question, the way he'd learned to ask things without pressing. Something like that. He didn't push further. Just handed her a dip of water from the bucket he'd hauled, and the small ordinary kindness of it, no pity in it, no curiosity. Just a man offering water to a woman who'd ridden a hot road, settled something in her chest that Mrs. Pruitt's careful scale weighing hadn't managed to unsettle in the first place. For what it's worth, Jonah said eventually, eyes on the fence line instead of on her, giving her the privacy of not being looked at directly. I've met a great many quality folk in my life, Mrs. Thorne. Most of them wouldn't know decency if it built their gate, and mended their fence for a week straight without being asked. That's supposed to be a compliment? Wasn't going for compliment, just observation. A ghost of that half-smile. Though I wouldn't mind if you took it as one. She did, though she didn't tell him so. Carried it with her through the rest of the afternoon, small and warm, the way a person carried a coal from the fire to start a new one somewhere else. By the fourth evening, they'd fallen into something like rhythm. Coffee at dawn, fence work through the heat, supper on the porch as the sky went gold, and then bruised and then dark, crickets picking up where the birds left off. Hazel found herself talking. More than she had in 3 years combined. My father built this place, she said one evening, needle moving through fabric on its own, her mind somewhere else entirely. Came out from Georgia after the war. Had nothing but a mule and a promise to my mother he'd give her land nobody could take. Jonah was carving something out of a scrap of cedar, curls of wood gathering at his boots. Didn't look up. But he was listening, she could tell by the way his hands slowed. Somebody tried to take it anyway, she went on, before she could stop herself. 15 years back. Neighboring spread claimed the boundary line was wrong. Went to court over it. Who won? We did. Her jaw tightened around the words. Cost my father everything he had left in him, though. Died 3 years after, worn clean through. Jonah's knife stopped moving, Kane, he said. Quiet. Almost to himself, Hazel's head came up fast. How do you know that name? A beat too long before he answered. Heard it mentioned. Around another lie. She counted them now, the way she counted stitches, quiet, careful, keeping the tally even when she didn't say the number out loud. 3 lies now, if she was being honest with the tally. 3 and counting. You lost someone too, she said instead of pushing. I can tell. His hands went still on the cedar. For a long moment he just looked out at the darkening fence line. Jaw working like a man deciding how much truth a person could survive hearing. Had a partner once, he said finally. In business. Trusted him with everything I had. While I was a Bwainscom stock, he spread word unfit. Tried to take the whole operation out from under me. Did he manage it? No, flat. Final. Won it back in court. But winning don't give you back what people believed about you in the meantime. Friends who turned their backs. That doesn't unturn just because a judge says you're innocent. They sat a while. The same lesson, she thought, worn different ways into 2 different lives, that the worst part of losing something wasn't the losing. It was the empty chair left after. The space at the table nobody filled back in. Whitlock, he said suddenly, into the quiet. Hazel blinked. What? My name. Full name. Jonah Whitlock. He said it like he was testing the weight of it out loud, seeing if it still fit right in his mouth, after wearing just Jonah so long. Figured you ought to have the whole of it, seeing as you gave me yours. Something in her chest loosened. Small thing. But it mattered the way the gate mattered, the way the fire laid before dawn mattered. Pleased to properly meet you. Then Mr. Whitlock. Pleasure's my Mrs. Thorne. He went back to his carving. She went back to her mending, and if either of them noticed, their chairs had crept closer together over the course of the evening. Neither one said so. The buggy came on the 5th day, right as the noon sun turned merciless. And the chickens went looking for shade under the porch. Hazel heard the wheels before she saw them too fast, too confident, the sound of a man who'd never once in his life worried about being unwelcome anywhere. She straightened up from the garden, dirt on her knees, and watched the black buggy roll toward her gate. 2 men inside. One heavy-set silk vest, straining at its buttons. One lean, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who watched a room like he was pricing the furniture. The heavy one climbed down first. Didn't wait to be invited through the gate. Just pushed it open and let it swing shut behind him. Careless. Like Jonah's careful latch 3 days back had never happened at all, Mrs. Thorne. A smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Silas Kane. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. Hazel's whole body went rigid at the name Kane. Because she knew that name the way she knew the scar on her own palm, old, familiar, still capable of aching on the right kind of day. I know who you are, she said. Then you'll know I don't waste a woman's time. Kane produced a folded paper from inside his coat, unfolded it with theatrical care, and held it out like a gift she was supposed to be grateful for. County's reassessed your property value. You're in arrears. $47, due by the 15th of August. The number landed like a fist. Hazel had $18 hidden in a tin under the floorboard. 3 years of pennies and dimes saved 1 careful coin at a time. 47 might as well have been the moon. I'm prepared to offer $200, Kane went on, smooth as poured oil. Cash? Today. You sign the deed over, settle your debt clean, and walk away with more money than most widows ever see in their lives. This is my home, he said, voice steady. Barely. With respect, Kane's eyes moved deliberate, taking in the small cabin, the dirt yard, the crooked chicken coop. This is 1 room and a patch of dirt a woman alone can't hope to hold on to. Better to take a fair price now than lose everything at auction for nothing. From behind her, Jonah's voice switched through, flat and precise as a blade laid on a table. 200 for 160 acres. He'd come up without a sound, hammer still loose in one hand. That's a little over $1 an acre. Land like this runs 5 times that easy. Kane's smile thinned considerably. And who might you be? Nobody you need concern yourself with, Jonah said. Just a man who can do sums. The air between them pulled taut, the way wire pulled taut right before it either held or snapped. Kane looked Jonah over once, his rough hands, his sun-worn shirt, the general shape of a man he had no reason to think twice about, and something in that assessment seemed to satisfy him enough to let the matter drop. Kane gathered his composure back around himself like a coat. Think on my offer, Mrs. Thorne. Auction set for the 15th, 9 in the morning, should you fail to appear with what's owed. His voice dropped, soft, and somehow worse for it. Be a shame if something delayed you getting there. The buggy rolled off, leaving dust and the gate swinging loose in its wake, the gate Jonah had just spent a morning fixing, hanging open again like nothing had changed at all. Hassal sank onto the porch step. Hands, for once, not steady at all. $18, she said, mostly to herself. Took me 3 years to save that much. Jonah sat down on the step below her, silent, steady, present in a way that felt strangely like the only solid thing left standing in the whole yard. This isn't about the taxes, he said finally. No. Her voice cracked right down the middle of the word. It's about my father beating them in court 15 years back. This is Kane finishing what he started. Jonah's jaw worked. His hands, she noticed, had curled into fists, resting on his knees like a man wrestling something down inside himself, something bigger than the moment called for. If you need to move on, Hazel said quietly, giving him the exit she assumed wanted. I'd understand. This isn't your fight. He turned to look at her then, straight on. No flinching, no calculating, just steady. I'm not leaving, he said. You don't owe me anything, maybe not. A muscle ticked in his jaw. But I've got resources most folks in your position don't. Lawyers who owe me favors. If you'll let me help. No, sharp, fast. Faster than she meant it. I can't be owing anybody again. Not for this. Not for anything. Because that was the thing nobody understood. The thing that lived under her ribs like a second. Angry or heart, she'd spent her whole life being handled. Pitied. Talked about like curiosity too large to be quite human. She could not be one more woman rescued. You're no drifter, she said instead, watching him careful now, cataloging every piece that didn't fit. I knew that the first morning, watching you fix that gate like you'd built one before. What aren't you telling me, Jonah Whitlock? He looked away. Out toward the fence line, toward the darkening edge of the world where the sun was starting its long fall. I'm a man trying to remember what decency looks like, he said finally. That's the truest thing I've got to give you right now. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. They sat like that a long while, the silence between them thick with everything neither one was ready to say out loud, while the tax notice fluttered off the portrait and skinfrittered across the dirt yard that bowled, mocking number chasing itself in small circles in the dust, over and over, like it knew exactly how little time was left. Night came down slow and merciless over the Texas plains. Hazel lay on her narrow bed, staring up at a ceiling she couldn't see in the dark, running the numbers over and over, like maybe if she added them different, they'd come out kinder. $47. 18 saved. 29 short, and no clever arithmetic was going to close that gap before the 15th. Daniel would have known some trick to stretch it. Daniel had always been better with numbers than she was one small ache to add to the larger one. $29 short. 3 weeks to find it. She heard him outside. Still awake on the porch, chair creaking soft under his weight, the small sounds of a man keeping watch, though nobody had asked him to. She should sleep. She should stop thinking about the particular stillness of his hands when he carved, the particular steadiness of his voice when Kane's smile turned sharp, the particular way he'd said, I'm not leaving, like it wasn't even a decision, like it was just fact, plain as weather. She should stop. She got up instead. Wrapped the quilt round her shoulders and went out to the porch, because sleep wasn't coming regardless, and at least out there the night air moved. Jonah glanced up. Didn't look surprised to see her. Can't sleep either, he said. Not a question, 3 weeks. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Lord, that's all I've got. He was quiet a moment, moonlight behind the line of his jaw, the old scars just visible where his collar sat open. You're not facing it alone, he said. Whatever else is true or isn't. That part's fact. Hazel looked out at the dark shape of the fence he'd mended, the gate hanging straight and true for the first time in 3 years, and let herself just for one reckless moment believe him. My grandmother used to say, she said softly into the dark, that a body finds out what they're made of the day they're down to their last loaf. and a stranger knocks. Never turn away a soul in need, she'd say. But she also said never trust a man with empty hands. A small, tired laugh. You had empty hands that first night, Jonah Whitlock. Still do, far as I can tell. Some hands emptier than others by choice, he said. Mine were emptied out on purpose. Different kind of empty than the kind your grandmother meant, maybe. That's supposed to comfort me. Wasn't going for comfort. Just truth. Best I could manage it, she almost smiled. Almost then the wind shifted. Carried something with it. A sound far off hoofbeats, maybe, or just her own nerves playing tricks in the dark. Jonah's head came up sharp. Listening, that's nothing, Hazel said. Coyotes most like, maybe. But his hand had already found the hammer resting against the porch rail, and he didn't set it back down. Because somewhere out past the fence line, past the reach of moonlight, something was moving through the dark that had nothing to do with coyotes at all in morning, when it finally came, was going to bring a great deal more than sunrise. They sat together a long while after that, not talking, just listening to the night settle back into its ordinary sounds, crickets, wind through the grass, the far-off complaint of some nightbird. Hazel found, somewhere in that shared silence, that the fear had loosened its grip on her chest just slightly, not gone, just loosened, enough to let her breathe easier than she had in 5 days. The next morning came in gray. No sunrise to speak of, just a slow lightening of the sky, like the day couldn't decide if it wanted to happen at all. Huzolf and Jonah already at the fence line, hammer in hand, checking wire that didn't need checking. Twice. Because that was what a man did when his mind wasn't on the work. He kept his hands busy so his thoughts couldn't catch him standing still. She watched him a moment from the porch. Coffee cooling in her hands. Steam curling up and vanishing into the flat morning air. Something shifted between them last night. She could feel it the way she felt weather coming pressure in the air, a tightness that hadn't been there before Kane's buggy rolled up the road. She carried a second cup out to him anyway. You didn't sleep, she said. Neither did you, I asked first, a ghost of a smile. Gone fast. Kept watch a while. Nothing came of it. Except he said it like a man who didn't quite believe his own words. Like he was listening even now, ears cocked toward the tree line, toward the road, toward whatever shape trouble might take next. Hazel let it sit, didn't push. She was learning him slow, way you learned a horse that had been mistreated before you got it careful hands. No sudden questions. I'm going to town, she said instead. Talk to Sheriff Cobb. Jonah's jaw went tight. About the tax notice? About my father's case, she looked at him steady. 15 years is a long memory for some folks to hold a grudge. I want to know why Kane's holding us so tight. I'll come with you. No, firm, final, the way her own father used to say things final. This is mine to walk into. You stay. Finish the fence. Something crossed his face, frustration maybe, or something closer to respect. She couldn't quite tell which, and didn't have time to work it out before she was already walking toward the barn to saddle the mule, because this was her fight, her father's name. And she was done letting men decide things around her, like she wasn't standing right there in the room. The ride to town took the better part of an hour, the mule ambling along a road baked hard by summer heat. And Hazel spent every minute of it turning over the same questions. Why now? Why, after 12 years of quiet, did Kane's family suddenly need her land bad enough to take a tax notice over it? What was worth all this trouble for 160 acres of ordinary Texas dirt, Sheriff Amos Cobb's office sat at the end of Main Street, squeezed between the feed store and a saloon that had seen better decades. Hazel ducked through the doorway. She ducked through most doorways. Out of long habit more than necessity, found the old sheriff hunched over a ledger, pretending to work. He looked up, and there it was. That flicker she knew too well, the half-second, where a person's eyes went up before they remembered their manners and dragged them back down to size. Hazel, he stood too fast, chair-scraping. Been a while? 15 years, she said. Since you helped bury my father. Cobb's face did something complicated. Guilt, mostly swearing an old man's wrinkles like a coat 2 sizes too big. Sit, she said. Not a request, he sat. Because Cobb had known her since she was a girl too big for her own school desk, and some habits of obedience ran deeper than a badge. Silas Kane came to my land yesterday, Hazel said. Talking taxes, talking auction. But that's not what this is about, is it, Amos? The sheriff's hands found the edge of his desk. Gripped it. Hazel, don't. Her voice cracked like a whip, low and sharp. Don't you dare hazel me like you're about to hand me something soft. I've had enough soft lies this week to last a lifetime. Silence stretched. Cobb looked at his own hands like they belonged to someone else. Kane's family lost that boundary case to your father, he said finally, slow. Like each word cost him something. Lost it bad. Nearly lost the whole spread, paying the court cost after. His daddy never recovered from the shame of it. That's 15-year-old history, Hazel said. Why's it matter now? Cobb's jaw worked. Worked some more, because there's silver, he said. Under your west ridge. Survey team came through 6 months back, quiet-like, working for Kane. Found a vein runs clean under your property line and into his. The room went very still. Hazel's whole understanding of the last 5 days rearranged itself in one long, sickening drop like a floor giving way underfoot. Silver, she repeated. He needs your acreage to work the claim proper. Boundary disputes on split veins get ugly in court. Faster just to own the whole vein outright. Cobb wouldn't meet her eyes now. The tax reassessment. That's Kane's doing. Man's got friends in the county office, and Her voice had gone dangerously quiet. You've known, and you let that man walk onto my land and threaten to take it. I owe him, Hazel. The words came out of Cobb like something torn loose. Owe him bad. Gambling debt 3 years back before my wife passed. He's been holding it over me ever since. I say one wrong word against him, he calls the note, and I lose my badge, my house, everything. Hazel stood. Slow, her shadow filled the small office like weather rolling in. My father beat Kane's father fair, she said, in open court, with truth. And now his son wants to take with lies what he couldn't win with facts. Hazel, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't pay $47, Amos. She was already at the door. And it sure doesn't dig silver back into the ground. She rode home with her mind churning faster than the mule's hooves could carry her. Because this wasn't about taxes. Never had been. This was about a 15-year-old wound that had never once stopped bleeding, dressed up in county paperwork and dollar signs. And somewhere in all that fury, one thought kept surfacing, cold and clear as spring water. If Kane knew about the silver, if he'd sent a survey team, then he'd been planning this for months. Long before a storm ever blew a stranger onto her porch. Which meant the timing of everything Jonah's sudden arrival, his careful silence, the way he flinched at the name Kane, the way he'd known that name before she ever said it out loud, none of it sat right anymore. None of it lined up clean. She rode faster. The ride back from Sheriff Cobb's office took Hazel past. The old Kane spread what remained of it at least. A once grand house, now showing its age at the edges, paint peeling from clapboard siding, the fences sagging in places nobody had bothered to mend. She slowed the mule without quite meaning to. Looked at the house a long moment. She remembered it different. From childhood remembered riding past with her father in the wagon. Remembered him going quiet and hard-jawed every time they passed. Remembered asking once, at maybe 8 years old, why Papa didn't like the Kane place, and getting only a short, clipped answer that told her more by what it didn't say than what it did. Some men measure their worth by what they can take from a neighbor, Hazel. Don't you grow up thinking that's how it's done. She hadn't understood it then. Understood it clear enough now, riding past that same house with the truth of the silver sitting heavy and dangerous in her chest, turning her father's old grudge into something far more dangerous than either of them could have known. An old woman sat on the porch of the Kane house, as Hazel passed Silas Kane's mother, if memory served. Though the years had worn her down to something small and fragile in a rocking chair, watching the road with eyes that seemed to see very little of what passed in front of them anymore. Their eyes met for one brief moment. Something flickered across the old woman's face recognition, maybe, or just the automatic response of a person noticing another person go by. Hazel nodded, out of old habit more than warmth, and the old woman nodded back, slow and uncertain, before looking away toward whatever private distance occupied most of her attention these days. Hazel rode on, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, that grudges outlived the people who started them. That the old woman on that porch had likely lost as much loyalty to this 15-year feud as Hazel's own family, had a husband who never recovered from shame, a son who'd apparently decided fraud and fire were acceptable tools for finishing what pride alone couldn't win. Nobody came out of a fight like this one clean. Not really. Not even the ones who won it. She carried that thought home with her, turned it over alongside everything else Cobb had told her, and found somewhat to her own surprise that it didn't soften her resolve one bit, except if anything, it sharpened it. Because whatever grief the Kane family carried, whatever old wound had festered into this, it did not give Silas Kane the right to burn her barn, or steal her land out from under her with forged paper and bought silence. Old pain was no excuse for new cruelty. Her father had taught her that too in his own quiet way, though she couldn't remember him ever saying the words outright. He'd simply lived at beaten the Kanes fair in open court, and never once, not in all the years after, gloated over the win or pressed his advantage further than the law allowed. That's the difference, Hazel thought, riding the last stretch home as the sun began its long fall toward evening. Winning fair and winning cruel. My father knew the difference. Silas Kane never learned it. Jonah was still at the fence when she got back, sweat-soaked, shirt clinging to his shoulders, working like a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. He looked up at the sound of her mule. Read something in her face immediately. She watched him read it. Watched the careful stillness come down over him like a curtain. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. A demand gentle as he could make it. "There's silver on my land." She dismounted rough, boots hitting dirt hard. Under the West Ridge. Kane's known for months. Sent survey men out quiet. Jonah's face didn't move. Didn't give her anything. "And Cobb's in his pocket," she went on, voice rising now, but months of held-back fury finally finding a crack to pour through. "Him from 3 years back. That's why the sheriff's done nothing. That's why nobody in this county's lifted a finger to help me. Hazel, how did you know his name?" She turned on him fast. "Too fast. That first evening I said Kane, and something crossed your face before you even had time to lie about it." "How?" "Silence. The kind of silence that told her everything and nothing at once." "I've heard the name," Jonah said finally. "Careful. Too careful. Cattle business. Everybody in that world's heard of Kane's dealings, one way or another." That's not an answer. Her voice shook now, and she hated that it shook. "That's the same nothing you gave me on this porch 5 days ago. Hazel. I swear to you, don't swear." She stepped back from him. Physical distance, the only kind she had left to give herself. "Just tell me who you are." "Really, because I buried a father and a husband, and I have exactly one more thing left in this world worth losing, and it is sitting under my own dirt, and I need to know if you're here to help me keep it or help someone else take it." Jones's jaw tightened, his hands curled at his sides, and for one long, terrible moment, Hazel thought he was going to lie again. He didn't. "I need 3 days," he said instead. Quiet, steady. 3 days, and I'll tell you everything, all of it. I swear on my mother's grave. Hazel, I am not your enemy in this. 3 days, she repeated. Flat, she held his eyes a long moment, weighing the words against every instinct that had kept her alive and whole out here on this land alone. 3 days, Jonah Whitlock. Not one more. And if you're lying to me, if you're one more piece of Kane's plan wearing a kind face. She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The look on her face finished it for her. "I'm not," he said. "I know that's not worth much right now, but I'm not." She looked at him a long moment. At the scars on his back she'd glimpsed that first morning. At the hands that had fixed her gate and mended her fence and laid her fire before dawn, unasked, unpaid, for 5 straight days. Everything in her wanted to trust that. And everything in her had learned, hard and early, exactly what trusting the wrong thing cost. 3 days, she said again, quieter this time, almost to herself as if saying the number twice might make it more binding. He was gone before dawn the next morning. Not run off, she checked the barn, checked the road, found his bedroll still folded neat on the porch, his hat still hanging on its peg. Gone foot toward the rail spur 2 miles east, she guessed, the one that ran a supply line up toward Fort Worth. A man in a hurry could catch the morning freight if he knew which fence posts to cut through, and something told her Jonah Whitlock knew exactly which posts. Hazel spent the day in a state of controlled fury, weeding a garden that didn't need weeding, mending fence that Jonah had already mended twice over. Anything to keep her busy while her mind spun through every possible version of who Jonah Whitlock really was. The house felt different with him gone. Hazel noticed it first in small things, the quiet at the breakfast table, the untouched second chair on the porch, the particular stillness of a cabin built for one person that had, for 5 brief days, felt built for 2. She caught herself, mid-morning, setting out 2 coffee cups from old habit before remembering, and the small foolish mistake of it lodged somewhere under her ribs like a splinter she couldn't quite work free. This is exactly why, she told herself, scrubbing the second cup clean and putting it back on its shelf with more force than necessary. A woman doesn't let herself get used to company. She thought of Daniel, some the particular ache of missing a person who'd been gentle and steady and entirely unprepared for the life fever had cut short. Daniel had never once, in 10 years of marriage, made her feel like a curiosity. Had simply loved her plain and ordinary, the way a person loved the weather they'd grown up under, without much comment or ceremony. She thought of her father, too, differently thought of the particular stubbornness that had built this cabin with a mule and a promise, that had stood in a courtroom against the Kane family and won on nothing but truth and grit. She wondered, not for the first time, what he would have made of Jonah Whitlock. Whether he'd have trusted a man who'd let a lie sit 5 days before correcting it, or whether he'd have seen past the lie to the gate fixed at dawn and the fence mended without complaint and understood. The way Hazel was slowly beginning to understand, that some men showed you who they were through their hands long before their mouths caught up to the truth. She didn't know the answer. Would know it, maybe, until Jonah either came back a partner or didn't come back at all. The uncertainty of that, the raw, unfamiliar vulnerability of caring whether a person returned, frightened her more than Kane's notice, more than the auction date circled in her mind like a wound that wouldn't scab over. She had spent 12 years since her father's death and 3 since Daniel's building walls precisely, so she'd never again have to feel this particular kind of fear. And here it was anyway. Small and stubborn and entirely unwelcome, sitting in her chest like a coal that refused to go out no matter how she tried to smother it. She was still turning that thought over, unresolved. By afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. Not Kane this time. A boy maybe 14, dust-covered, breathless, from running pounding up her road on a horse too big for him, Mrs. Thorne. He nearly fell off the animal in his hurry. Sheriff Cobb sent me. Said to tell you, said Kane's got men riding out tonight. Said to watch your barn. Hazel's blood went cold. Riding out for what? The boy swallowed hard, didn't say exact, just said watch the barn. Said watch it careful. He was gone again before she could ask more, kicking the horse back toward town like the devil himself was on his heels. Hazel stood in her yard a long moment, the sun sinking low and orange behind the west ridge, the ridge with silver running under it. Silver that had turned her whole life into a chessboard she hadn't agreed to play on. She went inside, loaded the shotgun, set it by the door, and then she waited. The second night passed without incident, though she barely slept for the listening. By the second morning there was still no sign of Jonah, and the silence of the empty porch felt louder than any storm had. Night came down heavy and starless. On the third evening, clouds banking up from the south like the sky itself was holding its breath. Hazel sat in the dark of her cabin, shotgun across her knees, every sense stretched, thin and humming. The chickens had gone quiet hours ago, too quiet. The kind of quiet that meant something out there in the dark had spooked them still. Midnight came, then past it. She almost convinced herself the boy had gotten it wrong. Almost let her shoulders drop. Then she smelled smoke, not the good kind, not her own hearth. Sharp and chemical, coal oil maybe, carried on a wind shifting toward her barn. Hazel was up and out the door before conscious thought caught up with her body. 3 men. She counted them in the dim starlight, 3 shapes moving fast around her barn. One crouched low with something in his hands, a torch just beginning to catch. "Get off my land," Hazel roared, and the sound of it full-throated, coming from a chest built bigger than most men's, stopped all 3 of them cold for one crucial half-second. Then the nearest one laughed. Actually laughed. Raising a torch high like her size was a joke he'd been told to expect. He should not have laughed. Hazel closed the distance in 4 strides that would have taken another woman 10. Her hand closed around his torch arm and squeezed, and something in his wrist gave way with a sound that ended the laughing very fast. He screamed. Dropped the torch. It hissed out in the wet grass. The second man came at her from the side. She felt him more than saw him, some old animal instinct kicking in, and she pivoted and caught him full across the chest with a forearm that had spent a lifetime hauling feed sacks and fence posts, and everything else this land demanded of her. He went down like a felled tree, stayed down. The third man ran, just ran, straight back toward the tree line, dropping his own unlit torch somewhere in his hurry, and Hazel let him go because the barn was still standing, and that was what mattered. She turned back to the 2 men groaning in her dirt. "Who sent you?" she said. Not a question. A demand that didn't leave room for anything but truth. The one with the broken wrist spat blood and didn't answer. That was when she heard hoofbeats. Fast. Coming hard up her road. Her whole body tensed until she recognized the shape in the dark. The particular way he sat a horse. The fact that he'd apparently found a horse somewhere in the last 3 days and ridden it half to death getting back. Jonah swung down before the animal had fully stopped, hammer already in hand from some instinct she recognized because she shared it, the instinct to arrive ready to fight for something. Hazel, he took in the scene fast, the downed men, the scorched grass where the torch had fallen, her standing over both of them, entirely unharmed, entirely furious. "Oh, you're all right. I'm fine, Flat." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the barn, still standing, still hers. "Where were you, Fort Worth?" He said it fast, like he'd rehearsed the confession the whole ride back. "Hazel, I need to tell you." They tried to burn my barn, her voice cracked, finally, all that held fury breaking loose at once. You asked me for 3 days. It's been 3 nights. And while you were off doing whatever it is you were doing, Cain's men were setting torches to my land, I know. God, I know. And I'm sorry I should have. Who are you, Jonah? She turned on him now, chest heaving, the moonlight catching the wetness in her eyes that she refused to call tears. Really, no more promises. Tell me now. He was quiet a long moment. The two men in the dirt groaned, forgotten between them. My name is Jonah Whitlock, he said finally, and I own the Whitlock Cattle Company out of Fort Worth. Second largest operation in the state. I left it 8 months ago because my own partner spread lies that cost me every friend I had, and I went walking because I didn't trust myself to know a true thing from a false one anymore. Hazel stared at him. Something in her chest went very still. You're rich, she said. Flat, I am. You let me think you were nothing. Some drifter with barbed wire cuts and no name worth giving. I didn't lie about the wounds being real, he said quietly. Just about how I got them. And I didn't lie about needing your porch, or being grateful for it, or he stopped. Started again, Hazel. I went to Fort Worth these 3 days, because I already suspected what Cobb told you. I've had a man watching Cain's dealings for weeks. I came here half believing. I already knew what kind of trouble was sitting on your land. You knew. Her voice had gone dangerously quiet. You knew about the silver before I did, I suspected. I didn't know for certain until my man confirmed the survey records 3 days ago. And you said nothing. Because I needed proof strong enough to bury Cain before I said a word that might tip him off that someone was circling. Jonah stepped closer, careful, the way you approach something wounded and dangerous both at once. Hazel, I have lawyers in Fort Worth right now building a case against every fraudulent tax reassessment Cain's pushed through this county in the last 2 years. I have enough money to end this fight tomorrow if you'll let me. I don't want your money. The words tore out of her, raw. I have spent my whole life being handled, Jonah. Managed talked about like I'm something too big to be trusted with my own decisions. I will not be one more thing you rescue. I'm not trying to rescue you. His voice, when it came, had an edge of real anger in it, now the first she'd heard from him. Hazel, look at what you just did. 3 men, and you put 2 of them in the dirt before I even got here. I didn't ride back tonight to save you. I rode back because I was terrified I wouldn't get here in time to stand beside you. The words landed harder than either of them expected. Hazel felt something crack loose in her chest, old and tightly wound. I don't know how to trust that, she said, quieter now. I know. He held her eyes steady. I don't have a fast way to fix that. Just give me the chance to prove it slow. Behind them, one of the fallen men groaned and started dragging himself toward the tree line. Neither of them moved to stop him, because there was something bigger sitting between them now than 2 petty arsonists could interrupt. You're leaving again, Hazel said. Not quite a question. I have to. Jonah's jaw tightened. I need to get back to Fort Worth. Finish what my lawyers started. Bring back everything I need to end this, the fraud records, the real survey documents. Enough proof to bury Cain so deep he never threatens you or anyone else in this county again. When tonight. Now, if I can, he looked toward the tree line where torchlight had so recently threatened everything she had. Hazel, the auction's in 12 days yet. I can be back with everything well before then. But I need you to trust me enough to hold this ground until I do. She looked at him a long moment. At the man who fixed gets and laid fires and had just ridden his horse half to death to stand beside her against men with torches. At the man who was also, apparently, one of the wealthiest cattlemen in Texas, who had led her believe otherwise for 5 straight days. Go, she said finally. Finish it. But Jonah, he waited. Don't you dare come back with a check made out in my name like I'm some charity case you're settling a debt with. You come back a partner, or you don't come back to this land at all. Something in his face shifted, relief and respect tangled together, unmistakable even in the dark. Partner, he said. I can work with that. He was gone within the hour, riding hard for Fort Worth and our sky just beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. Hazel stood alone in her yard long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, the scorched patch of grass by her barn still smoking faintly in the pre-dawn chill. 12 days. She thought of her father, 15 years gone from that courtroom victory, 12 years in the ground, who'd stood his ground against a cane once before and won it fair. She thought of Daniel, 3 years in the ground, who'd never gotten the chance to fix a single broken thing on this land before the fever took him. And she thought of Jonah Whitlock, riding hard toward a city full of lawyers and money, and everything she'd spent her whole life mistrusting carrying with him the one promise that mattered, partner. She walked back inside as the sun finally broke the horizon, gold light spilling slow across land that was still, for 12 more days at least, entirely her own. She set the shotgun back by the door. Didn't put it away. 12 days was not nearly enough time to stop being afraid. But it was, she decided, watching the light climb higher over the west ridge, over silver she hadn't asked for, and a fight she hadn't started exactly enough time to stop waiting for someone else to win it for her. She had 2 hands, 160 acres, a tin of $18, and now, somewhere riding hard through the dark toward Fort Worth, one man who'd looked at her plain and clear for 5 nights running and never once flinched. It would have to be enough, because in 12 days, Silas Kane was going to learn exactly what kind of woman he'd decided to underestimate. 12 days moved slower than any 12 days that ever moved in Hazel Thorne's life. She counted them the way she counted stitches. 1, then another, until the counting itself became a kind of prayer, because waiting was its own particular hell. Worse than fighting. Fighting, at least, gave her hands something to do. She mended fence that didn't need mending, fed chickens that had already been fed, walked the boundary line of her 160 acres like her boots alone could hold the ground in place through sheer repetition. On the 6th day, a rider she didn't recognize came up the road at an easy trot, not Kane's men, not Cobb's boy, but a stranger in a plain traveling coat who introduced himself as a courier out of Fort Worth. Carrying seal letter and instructions to wait for no reply, Hazel's hands weren't quite steady breaking the seal. Inside, a single page, Jonah's handwriting tighter and more formal than she'd have guessed from a man who carved cedar by lamplight. Mrs. Thorne's survey records confirmed beyond dispute. 3 additional families in the county affected by similar fraud, their stories now sworn and filed. Judge Harmon has agreed to hear testimony on the 15th, regardless of outcome at auction. Whatever happens that morning, the truth comes out either way. Hold steady. No flowery words, no promises beyond what he could keep. It read, if anything, like a man reporting to a business partner, rather than a woman he'd held on to a little too long on her own porch 3 nights back. And somehow that plainness comforted her more than poetry might have. Her father had written letters like that too. She remembered, short, factual, trusting the reader to fill in the rest with whatever faith they had left. She folded the letter and tucked it into the same tin where she kept her $18, an odd pairing of hope and hard arithmetic, sitting side by side in the dark. That evening she read it again on the porch, twice, then a 3rd time, before she caught herself and set it down, embarrassed at her own hunger for a handful of plain sentences from a man she'd known less than 2 weeks total. Still, she left the lamp burning a little longer than usual that night and didn't examine too closely why 3 more days passed without word after that. But the letter held her through them, the way a single plank held a bridge thin, but enough if a body was careful about her footing. Sheriff Cobb came by on the 9th day. Wouldn't meet her eyes at first, wanted you to know, he said, standing awkward in her yard, hat turning in his hands. I sent word to the county judge, told him what I know about the survey records, about the debt Kane's been holding over me. Why now, Hazel said, not soft, not yet ready to be soft with him, because a boy nearly got burned alive delivering my warning to your barn, Cobb said. And because I've spent 15 years telling myself silence wasn't the same as lying. Turns out it is. He finally looked up at her. I'm sorry, Hazel, for your father. For all of it, she studied him a long moment. Old man, older now than she remembered him being just 2 weeks back, weighted down by a guilt he'd carried alone for years. Testify, she said, at the auction. In front of the judge, in front of the whole town. That's how you make it right, Amos. Not apologies in my yard. He nodded. Once. Firm, I'll be there, he said, whatever it costs me. On the 11th day, a visitor came that Hazel hadn't expected at all. Mrs. Pruitt of the general store, standing awkward at Hazel's gate with a covered basket in her hands, and an expression that suggested she wasn't entirely sure why she'd come herself instead of sending it with someone else. Brought you some preserves, Mrs. Pruitt said, holding the basket out at arm's length like it might bite her. Peach, made extra this season. Hazel took it, careful, studying the woman's for the usual carefulness, the usual measuring look. Didn't find it quite, found something else instead. Something closer to shame, sitting uneasy around Mrs. Pruitt's mouth. Heard about the auction, Mrs. Pruitt said, when the silence stretched too long for comfort. Heard what Kane's trying to do to you. My husband's cousin lost 40 acres to a reassessment 2 years back, same kind of business. We didn't think much of it at the time. She looked down at her own hands. Should have thought more of it. Why now? Hazel asked. Not unkind. Just tired of the question having a different answer every time someone new arrived at her gate. Because decent's supposed to mean something, Mrs. Pruitt said, even when it's inconvenient. I've spent a fair number of years careful around you, Hazel Thorne, on account of you being, she gestured, helpless at the general fact of Hazel's size, her difference, the whole complicated weight of it, different than most. Told myself that carefulness was just manners. Wasn't manners. Was fear, mostly, dressed up nice. Hazel didn't know what to say to that. Stood holding a basket of peach preserves in the hot afternoon sun, feeling that she didn't have a ready name for. I'll be at the auction, Mrs. Pruitt said. Whole town will be, I expect. Whichever way it goes. A pause. Hoping it goes your way. For what that's worth from someone who's given you precious little reason to trust the hoping. She left before Hazel could find words steady enough to answer with, walking back down the road toward town with her empty hands swinging at her sides. Hazel carried the basket inside and set it on the table, and found herself later that evening telling the empty porch about the visit, as though Jonah were still sitting there to hear it, old habit, 5 days deep already, of talking through her day to a person who wasn't there to listen. Strange thing, she said aloud, to nobody, to the darkening yard and the silent chickens, and the fence running straight and true toward the horizon. 12 years of careful silence from this county, and now everybody's finding their nerve at once, she thought, watching the last light fade over the west ridge. That perhaps courage worked that way, sometimes quiet and solitary, until suddenly, given the right nudge, it wasn't solitary at all. Perhaps her own stand against Kane's, small and stubborn as it was, had given other people permission to remember decency was supposed to cost something, and to pay that cost anyway. It wasn't much comfort against the fear sitting heavy in her chest about the 15th, but it was something. And these days, Hazel Thorne had learned to hold tight to whatever something she could find. The remaining days crawled by in a haze of heat and dust and dread. Hazel found herself, more than once, standing at the edge of her property looking east, as if she might will Jonah's return into being through sheer force of watching. He didn't come. Not on the 10th day, not the 11th. By the 12th day, hope had worn thin as her mended fence wire. The 15th of August came in hot and merciless, the kind of Texas heat that pressed down on a body like a hand on the chest. Hazel dressed in her one good black dress that morning, morning dress, technically, though she'd stopped thinking of it that way somewhere in the last 2 weeks. Now it just felt like armor. No word from Jonah. Not in 4 days. She told herself that was fine. Told herself a man building a legal case against a corrupt land agent didn't have time for letters. Told herself this 3 or 4 dozen times before she finally believed enough to stop checking the road every hour. Except she checked it anyway. One more time, just in case marode. Same as the way she saddled the mule and rode toward town alone, because that was how this had to happen, win or lose. This was her fight, her father's name, her land, and if Jonah Whitlock couldn't make it back in time, then she would stand on that courthouse step without him, and she would still stand. The courthouse square was already crowded when she arrived. Word traveled fast in a small county, and half the town had turned out to watch a widow lose her land to the richest man in the region. Hazel felt every eye on her as she dismounted, felt the particular weight of being watched that had followed her whole life, except today it wasn't just her size drawing the stares. Today it was pity. Today it was the particular cruelty of a crowd that had already decided how this story ended. Kane stood at the top of the courthouse steps, dressed sharp, smiling like a man already counting silver he hadn't dug up yet. The county clerk cleared his throat. Unfolded a paper. Thorne property, he announced. 160 acres. Tax debt of $47 outstanding. Do I hear an opening bid? $50, Kane called out. Easy, confident. A man who already knew he'd won, Hazel's stomach dropped straight through the courthouse steps. Because $18 sat in her pocket, everything she had, and $50 might as well have been the whole state of Texas for all the good it would do her now. She opened her mouth. To say what, she didn't know yet. Some plea, some last stand, something. I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Thorne. The voice cut through the crowd like a rifle shot. Hazel turned, and there he was. Except this wasn't the man who'd sat quiet on her porch with a bleeding shoulder and a borrowed name. This was a man in a tailored dark suit, boots polished to a shine, walking through that crowd like the whole square was to him. Which she was slowly beginning to understand. In some sense it very well might. Jonah Whitlock climbed the courthouse steps and stood beside her. Close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers. $47, he said. Voice carrying clean across the stunned square. Clears the tax debt in full. He counted the bills out himself. Slow, deliberate, making sure every soul in that crowd watched him do it. That concludes the county's business here, he went on. The auction is void. A murmur swept the square like wind through wheat. Kane's face had gone the color of old paper. Who in God's name are you to interrupt county business? Jonah handed him a card. Hazel watched Kane's hand shake reading it. Joe Whitlock, he said. Whitlock Cattle Company, Fort Worth. Recognition rippled outward through the crowd in waves, whispers, gasps. Someone near the back saying the name aloud like it explained everything. Hazel felt something cold settle in her chest, even as relief flooded through it, because he had known. All along that first stormy night, he had known exactly who he was and let her believe otherwise. You should have told me, she said. Quiet, just for him. I know. But there was no time for that conversation now, because Kane had recovered his composure and stepped forward, sharp-eyed and dangerous. This changes nothing, Kane said. The taxes were owed regardless of who pays them. My interest in this property remains entirely legal. Does it? Jonah's voice went cold as creek water in January. Sheriff Cobb? Cobb stepped forward from the crowd. Stood tall for the first time in 15 years, Hazel thought, watching him. I have testimony, Cobb said, voice carrying across the stunned square, regarding fraudulent survey documents filed on the Thorne property. Regarding a debt Mr. Kane has held over me for 3 years, used to secure my silence about a mining claim he's been quietly pursuing on land that isn't his. The square went dead silent. That's a lie, Kane snapped, but something had cracked in his voice. Some hairline fracture and all that confidence, is it? Jonah produced a folder from inside his coat, thick, official-looking, the kind of paperwork that took real money and real lawyers to assemble. I have copies of the original survey filed 6 months ago under a false name, cross-reference with the county recorder's actual boundary maps from the Thorne-Kane case 15 years back. I have banking records showing payments from Mr. Kane to 3 separate county tax officials over the past 18 months. He turned. Faced Kane directly, close enough the whole crowd could see the two men measure each other. Your father lost that boundary case fair, Mr. Kane, Jonah said, quiet now, quiet enough that the whole square leaned in to hear it. 15 years, and you've spent every one of them trying to steal with fraud what he couldn't win with truth. Kane's hand moved, fast, sudden, toward his coat, towards something Hazel understood with sick clarity a half-second before the crowd did. She didn't think. She moved. 7 feet of her crossed that courthouse step in less time than most bodies took to register danger at all. Her hand closed around Kane's wrist exactly as the pistol cleared his coat, and she wrenched it upward and sideways with a force that sent the weapon spinning out across the courthouse steps, clattering down into the dust below. Kane screamed. Wrist bent wrong. The same terrible angle she'd left on that torch-carrying arsonist 12 nights back. The whole square had gone silent. 200 people frozen mid-breath, watching Hazel Thorne hold the richest, cruelest man in the county pinned against a courthouse pillar with one hand. That's twice now, she said. Low enough only Kane could hear it, that somebody's tried violence on my watch and lost. She released him. He crumpled, cradling his wrist, all that oily confidence gone clean out of him. Sheriff Cobb moved fast then, fuss already out, years of guilt apparently finding useful outlet in the swiftness of the arrest. Silas Kane, Cobb said, voice steady and clear across the square. You're under arrest for attempted assault, for fraud against Hazel Thorne, and for every county official you've bought silent these past 2 years. The crowd erupted not in outrage, Hazel realized slowly, but in something closer to awe. Whispers turning to something warmer. Someone near the front actually clapped, awkward and alone at first, until it caught and spread. Because the woman they'd spent years whispering about, the giant curiosity nobody quite knew what to do with, had just disarmed an armed man with her bare hands to protect the truth. Hazel stood in the settling dust, chest heaving, and looked at Jonah. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Something between wonder and something much softer. "You lied to me," she said. The crowd noise faded around them till it was just the two of them standing on those steps, that first night. Every night since, really, until Cobb's boy came running with the warning. "I never lied about being poor," Jonah said quietly. "I just never corrected what you assumed. I needed to know if I'd have taken you in regardless." Her voice was rough. "If kindness like my grandmother taught me was real, or just something people say. Something like that. You tested me. Yes, no hesitation now. No hiding. And Hayes, you are the finest person I have ever known in my life. Rich or poor, giant or small. None of that ever mattered once I sat on your porch that first night, and you gave me a chair anyway. When every instinct in you said not to trust a stranger with empty hands, Hazel felt something crack wide open in her chest-old walls built brick by brick over years of stares and whispers, and being handled like a curiosity instead of a woman. "You should have trusted me with the truth," she said. "Quieter now. From the start, I know." He held her eyes steady. "I'm asking you to let me earn that trust properly now, however long it takes." She looked at him a long moment, this man who'd fixed her gait before he ever asked for breakfast, who'd ridden through the night to stand beside her against torches, who'd just spent 4 silent days building an entire legal case to protect land that wasn't even his. "Partners," she said finally. That's word you used 12 days ago. That still stand?" Every single word of it. She held out her hand. "Not for romance, not yet. For something steadier, a handshake, plain and solid, the kind two people gave each other when they meant business." Jonah took it, held it a moment longer than strictly necessary. The weeks that followed moved differently than any Hazel had known before. Kane's trial came and went by early September, the fraud charges piling up faster than the county courthouse had ever seen. Falsified surveys, bribed officials, 3 other families across the county who'd nearly lost land the same way she almost had. He'd be old before he saw open sky again. The judge made sure of that. Sheriff Cobb kept his badge for the time being. Testified against Kane in full. Cleared his own debt to the county's satisfaction. And Hazel found herself, strangely, forgiving him faster than she expected to. 15 years of guilt written plain on a man's face was its own kind of punishment. Jonah didn't return to Fort Worth. Not permanently. He sold controlling interest in Whitlock Cattle Company that October, keeping only enough involvement to draw a fair income, and put the rest of his fortune quietly into rebuilding what 15 years of neglect and 3 years of grief had let fall apart on Hazel's 160 acres. New barn, built with her hands as much as his, 'cause she would not stand by and watch it built without her. And he never once suggested she should. New fence, running true clean around the whole property line. No more gaps for storms or strangers or trouble to slip through. And on a quiet October morning, with the Westridge gold and early silver beneath, finally, properly claimed and shared, half hers, half his, exactly 50-50, the way they'd agreed on that first terrible, wonderful night after the barn nearly burned. Hazel Thorne stood beside her father's grave with Jonah's hand in hers. "We're staying," she said, soft, certain, building something new here. And I'm not standing alone in it anymore. Jonah's fingers tightened around hers. "Partners," he said. In every sense of the word. Mrs. Pruitt came by again in late September, this time with no basket. Just an invitation the county was holding a harvest gathering at the church grounds. First one in 3 years since the drought had made such things feel foolish to plan. And would Hazel care to come? Hazel almost said no out of old reflex. Stopped herself. Said yes instead and found, walking into that gathering on Jonah's arm 2 weeks later, early October, the new barn barely a week finished, that the careful silences she'd grown so used to had thinned considerably. People still looked. Of course, some habits took longer than a single scandal to break, but the looks had changed character, less measuring. More simply curious, the ordinary curiosity neighbors held for each other's business, the kind that came with an invitation to sit rather than a reason to whisper. The three families Keynes had defrauded come forwardly, publicly that autumn, emboldened by the trial, and told their own stories to anyone willing to listen. Boundary lines quietly redrawn, tax reassessments that never quite made sense, small pressures applied over years until families desperate enough finally sold at a fraction of true value. The county judge, moved by the pattern of it, ordered a full review of every land transaction Keynes had processed in the past 5 years. As for Silas Keynes' mother, the old woman on the porch, Hazel rode out to the Kane place once more. That November, on an impulse she couldn't entirely explain to herself, found the old woman still on her porch, still rocking, and sat with her a while in some silence before either of them spoke. "Your boy did wrong," Hazel said finally. "Not cruel, just true. I know it," the old woman said, a voice thin as paper. "Knew it a long while before the county did. Didn't have the strength left to stop him." A pause, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "My husband taught him that land was worth any cost to hold on to. I should have taught him different." "Did that failing's mine as much as his." Hazel didn't offer forgiveness. Exactly, that wasn't hers to give. Not for fraud and fire and a gun drawn on a courthouse step. But she offered something smaller, something that felt, in the moment, more honest than forgiveness would have been. "Land's not worth what it costs a person's decency," Hazel said. "Wish Sethauti had told my father the same, way back when, so he might have let the whole business go easier once he'd won it fair. Maybe your boy would have grown up a different." Watching two families let an old wound close instead of picking at it for 15 years. The old woman didn't answer that, not directly. Just nodded, slow, and looked back out at the road, and Hazel rode home with a strange, unresolved feeling, settling into her chest, not quite peace, but something adjacent to it. The beginning of an ending, maybe. The song's slow work of two families finally letting an old grudge lie down and rest. 2 more of the fraudulent seizures were reversed by December, families restored to land they'd nearly lost forever. Hazel found some grim satisfaction in that, though it didn't erase the 12 years of grief that had led her to this point. Nothing could do that, but it meant her father's fight, all those years back, Hadn't been an isolated victory, soon forgotten it had been. She understood now, the first crack in a pattern that had finally fully broken. Sheriff Cobb resigned his position that December anyway. Despite Hazel's testimony on his behalf, despite the county's willingness to let him keep his badge, that had carried the weight of his silence long enough that he didn't trust himself to wear the badge with a clean conscience anymore. He took work instead, managing the county's new land records office, cross-checking every deed and survey that came through for exactly the kind of fraud he'd once looked away from. Hazel thought that suited him better anyway, a man spending his remaining years making sure nobody else's silence cost a family their home. The following spring brought the first real taste of everything they'd built a wet season, heavier rains than the county had seen in years, the kind that had once torn Hazel's old gate half off its hinges on a night that felt now like it belonged to some other woman's life entirely. The new gate held, the new fence held, the new barn, roof pitched steeper than the old one on Jonah's insistence, shed the rain clean and kept every head of stock half dry through 3 straight days of downpour that would have flooded the old structure to its rafters. Hazel stood on the porch watching the storm roll through, Jonah beside her in the second rocking chair, and found herself thinking of that first night more than she expected to the stranger at her gate, hat in his hands, asking for nothing more than a dry place to wait out the weather. Storm's not so frightening the second time around, she said, mostly to herself. Wasn't the storm that frightened you the first time, Jonah said. Was wondering what kind of man walked into it. Turned out to be a fair kind of question to wonder about. He reached over, took her hand callous palm against callous palm, 2 people who'd built something with their hands long before they built it with words. Turned out to be a fair kind of answer, too. I hope. She didn't answer that directly. Just watched the rain sheet off the new barn roof. Watched cool and run clean toward the fence line instead of toward her door. And thought that some questions didn't need answering out loud. Some answers just sat there, plain and solid, the way a good fence sat proof enough of itself, needing no further explanation. 2 rocking chairs sat on the porch now, side by side, facing east toward the rising sun. And if the whole county had once whispered about the woman too big to be loved, too strange to be wanted, too much for any ordinary man to stand beside without flinching well. They didn't whisper that anymore, because standing on that porch in the gold morning light, hand in hand with a man who'd never once flinched, not from the very first stormy night, Hazel Thorne had finally fully understood something her grandmother tried to teach her a lifetime ago. Kindness, offered freely to a stranger with empty hands, had a way of coming back around. Sometimes slow, sometimes disguised, but it came back around all the same. The chickens scratched in the yard. The silver ran quiet and unseen beneath the west ridge. No longer a curse, but simply what always should have been resource, not weapon. And 2 lives once marked separately by loneliness, one by grief and one by betrayal, began again together on land that had finally, after 12 long years, Stop being fought over and started simply being home.